Tell me about a time when you made a mistake. Hey everyone, welcome back to another Exponent Engineering Manager mock interview. My name's Kevin Wei, and I'm super delighted to have Rahul as a guest on today's mock interview. Rahul is a Director of Engineering at Square, and we're going to be doing a leadership question today. Before we get into the actual mock interview, I'm going to have Rahul just briefly introduce himself and maybe tell us a little bit about some of the things he's worked on.
My name is Rahul. I am currently in the role of Director of Engineering at Square. We technically don't have titles, but basically I'm leading a team of several engineering managers and engineers working on one of our point of sales. I've been at Square for about 6 years at this point. I started in 2016. I came on board as an IC and worked on this team, and then eventually sort of stepped into the EM role. I was there for several years as the team grew. I was given the opportunity to sort of lead the entire engineering org, which is the role I'm in today. But so yeah, it's been six fruitful years. Prior to Square, I was at a startup. I was a CTO at a startup in San Francisco. For about 4 years, grew the product engineering org to about 15, 20 people till, we had business wasn't doing too well and we had to sort of reduce our size to a little bit. Prior to this startup, I was at an e-commerce startup in Palo Alto as an engineer for a couple of years, and then prior to that, I started my professional career in Silicon Valley at Oracle, working on databases, I guess. But my journey to the US, I came here as a grad student, got my master's in CS at Stanford in '08.
Awesome. Thanks for introducing yourself there. And it's super cool to hear your journey and how you got to where you are today. So like I mentioned, we're going to do a leadership type question today. Basically, these kind of questions are asked in EM or even PM interviews. In theory, they're used to judge maybe your performance or how you think and how you approach problems. So yeah, let's jump right into it. So Rahul, this is the question I'd like to ask you today. Tell me about a time when you made a mistake.
I've made so many mistakes. It's kind of a little hard to sort of pick the right one, but I think one crucial component of being a people leader is sort of relationship building, and in terms of mistakes, sort of it brings me to a point where I feel like I wasn't treating my relationships. I wasn't giving them high priority enough, and also the communication around that was messy. I mean, this was back before, way before COVID, when we were all in the same office, right? So technically, it's easier to communicate when you're sort of in person, and so this is even more crucial now in sort of the remote first world. But sort of the mistake I want to talk about is I I had developed a bit of a defensive attitude towards suggestions. So even talking to my boss or other cross-functional stakeholders like my PM partners or designers, almost every suggestion or every thought started with a no, and here's why not, right? And so for some reason, I don't know whether it was ego or whether it was burnout or it's hard for me to sort of figure out exactly why that was, but it led to a it led to a point in my career where I started seeing that, hey, I'm going to stall my own growth if I don't build up a stronger working relationship with these folks who are sort of crucial to not just my career but also the product development aspect of my day-to-day job. And I got this feedback from my manager like, hey, listen, I think that you need to sort of reevaluate how you're coming to these discussions where you start off with a completely negative tone. And and I really took that to heart, and since then I think I have reevaluated how to sort of talk to people in when making suggestion, right? I mean, I think that the sort of the mistake I made was sort of being too negative and sort of not approaching communication the right way. And the learning I got from that was, or sort of the changes I made to my approach were to use the yes and philosophy. And this comes from improv, where in an improv setting, you kind of, whatever this other person is doing, you carry forth that thread. You don't end it. And so moving from a no and here's why I went to a yes and I feel like that had a somewhat of a magical transformation, not just to my relationship with people, not just to sort of how I made others feel in my presence, but also to my career and various other things. And um, I think that's sort of a big realization to me. I wasn't being self-aware enough, and somebody showed me the mirror. That's when I realized, and I think that the technique I used was the yes and that has helped me quite a bit.
So, can you give me an example of like when you used a no and when you used like a yes and? Like, were these situations when other teams were coming to you to ask for a dependency, for example?
Right. So I mean, I work on a product team, so we are usually on the other side of we are asking for others, but others for we are dependent on others. So I mean, totally. So from that perspective, right, when you're working with a partner who all the time is just like no, no, no. I mean, it just seems it's like you kind of want to stop working with them, or you feel bad about where you work and all of the negatives that come with it. Right? But imagine you're in a meeting and somebody makes a suggestion like, "Hey, how about we think about it in this way?" Or like, "Why wouldn't? Why? Hey, can we think about?" It? And you say, "No, that's not going to work." Or no, if you have somebody in the room who is just constantly shooting down ideas, I mean, that's terrible, right? Um, Rather than you kind of trying to be a good listener, like, yes, okay, I think I can see why you're saying that, and here's why that maybe worth experimenting, maybe not, but it's just you kind of flip the framing a little bit. I'm not saying that you need to kind of if you have strong fundamental beliefs, I'm not saying you need to kind of hide them or anything. It's a matter of sort of um, bringing them along to your thinking, but also making sure they feel heard, that you're not like, oh, no, not at all, and we tried that in the past, it's not never going to work. So it's like, I'll give you a concrete example. Like somebody joined the team recently. They said, "Hey, why don't we do this?" And I mean, the fact is, we had tried that idea in the past and it hadn't worked. So instead of saying no, we tried it in the past, it's not going to work. Uh, I kind of was of the opinion like, yes, and this time when we try it, let's make sure to avoid A, B, and C, because last time when we tried it, it didn't work. And so maybe it's time again to try it, but let's make sure to avoid these pitfalls that we ran into last time, right? So yeah, kind of uh, just like flips the whole situation, right? Instead of you being somewhat of an adversarial person in the room, you're like, well, this is great. Uh, Thank you for the idea. Here's what happened last time, but maybe we can try it again, and let's watch out for A, B, and C.
Yeah, thanks for that example. Actually, I see that in my work also all the time. When someone's a new hire, they join, they have ideas that we've already considered in the past, and it's like really easy to shoot down ideas, but it's a lot harder to think about like, hey, like how can we iterate? How can we like, be a better counterpart to these coworkers? Um, I like to dive a little deep into the conversation that happened with your manager when like this topic came up. I think like you called out like, hey, like maybe you had an ego or maybe you were having burnout. How did you handle that conversation when your manager gave you this kind of feedback?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I feel like we were having a couple exchanges which weren't productive, right? It was almost like somewhat of an adversarial exchange, and I realized this isn't going too well, but I didn't have sort of the mental model or the tools in my head to kind of make sense of that. It was easy to blame others, but when my manager, who I trust and respect, kind of showed me what he thought and brought some examples, I was like, hey, I actually think I think there's this saying that if you go through the day and everyone you meet is an a-hole, then maybe you are the a-hole, right? So it's basically that is what happened when I was shown the mirror and I was given this feedback. I was like, hey, actually, I think this might be something that is wrong with me. um, so that realization, firstly, I think the feedback coming from somebody you trust and respect is very important, because that immediately draws a lot of you put a lot of weight to it. And I took some time to quietly self introspect And I think that's when initially any sort of feedback of this sort can be hard to hear, but I think because I respected the person who I was getting the feedback from, I think it was that kind of the radical candor moment
Yeah.
for me, and it I think very quickly I made a change because I realized this is actually worse than I thought it is.
Yeah, and I mean, like now that you're, you went through like the EM, and now you're like a director of engineering role. How might you, if you notice like this kind of behavior in someone who reports to you, how might you handle that conversation, or how might you approach them with this kind of feedback?
Yeah, and I've had to deal with people. I think one thing is sort of being point blank in terms of sort of hey, here's the situation and this is sort of your tone, and I think a bunch of people felt in a certain way, and do you agree with this or not, kind of showing them a little bit of that, and making them see if they realize that or not. I also sort of talk about there's certain books that are like crucial conversations, or non-violent communication. These are really good books where when it comes to sort of making sure that people have sort of the right set of tools or mental model sort of be thinking about this. But again, I think what I tell them, give my own example, like, hey, these are things that if y'all are not paying attention to, this can be career limiting, and it's important to get your point across, but it's also important to make sure the other person gets heard, and that the conversation is always moving productively forward rather than you trying to sort of snip it in the middle, and that's not a good look for anybody.
Got it. Cool. Well, thanks for your answer to this mock interview. I've been taking some notes as you've been kind of talking. I'll give you some of like the notes that I've been taking down, and I'd love to hear at the end just like any tips you would give the audience if they're interviewing for like any EM or director of engineering role. So I think like the thing that I really liked in how you would handle like giving this feedback to someone else is how you mentioned that you would share your own personal stories. You might give them some books so they can like have some mental models to think about like the right way to approach these kind of relationships. Because at the end of the day, like as an EM or even like a director of engineering, like in and out of the day, you're probably working with many people, and people don't want to work with someone who's an a-hole. I really liked how you show that you would build like positive relationships, and like you take responsibility for any kind of like human shortfalls that you might have, like hey, maybe like burnout or ego. And I think it's really important that you show that you openly acknowledge the mistakes you've made here. So I think those are probably some of the most important things that the interviewer will be looking for if they ask you this kind of question in an interview. But yeah, that's the notes that I've been taking here. Rahul, do you have any sort of tips or advice that you would give the audience if they're going for an EM or director of engineering role?
Yeah, I mean, for this particular question, I think one thing that is important, or what the sort of interviewer wants to know, is uh, does this person exhibit a growth mentality or not, right? Um, because quite often, right, you want to go from a person who has was complete novice in a certain area, and then you taught you figured out what was wrong somehow, or somebody told you, and then you had the self-awareness to like, okay, that indeed is not right, and you can correct it, and you can become a better version of yourself over time. So that's sort of one of the important things to sort of make sure you are able to communicate, like, hey, I had this growth moment, and I was up for it, and I made it happen. um, but yeah, I mean, overall, in terms of sort of interviews for EM or director roles, I every org is looking for different kinds of people, and so there is no one size fit all. But I do think that having a framework based thinking towards sort of some of the more foundational things around people management, product development, cross functional relationships, technology, um, having organized thoughts that you can present in a succinct manner is exactly what impresses people on the other side, followed with very concrete examples, right? It can't just be theoretical, it has to be you have to back it up with concrete examples from your past experience. So I think that's sort of the key.
Totally. Yeah, agreed that you don't want to ramble. You want to give some kind of structure and you want to give some kind of concrete example. Kind of like how you gave the example of, hey, there's a new hire and they propose some idea that the team's already thought through. And I think specifically for this question, like what you want to avoid is avoid like, showing that you would publicly criticize the person or showing that you like blame others or showing that you try to cover up any mistakes. Those are the kind of things that you don't want to show for a question like this. All in all, thanks for coming on today's show, Rahul. And for the viewers watching at home, good luck with your upcoming engineering manager interview.